You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects, and today we journey into the life of one of the most fascinating figures of early modern science, Tycho Brahe. A man who lost part of his nose in a duel over math, a man who built an island laboratory palace and who believed the stars didn't just light the heavens but shape destinies. Tycho was an astronomer, astrologer, alchemist, and court mystic. In this episode, we chart Tycho Brahe's astronomical achievements while interweaving the intimate episodes that shaped him. The duel that cost him his nose, the shadow of his unborn twin, the bonds of his marriage, and the enigmatic presence of Jepp, the dwarf at Uraniborg. Through his observatories and his household alike, we glimpsed the Renaissance mind at work, where rigorous measurement met alchemical hope, and the mystic's intuition shared a table with the astronomer's instruments. In tracing both his calculations and his character, we ask what the alchemists and mystics of the past were truly like, and what their world can still teach us about the human hunger to know. I have measured the sky. Now I measure the shadows of the earth. My mind belonged to the heavens, my body to the earth. Written by Tycho Brahe, allegedly for his own epitaph. Tycho was born on December 14, 1546, in Knudstrup, a region that was then part of Denmark, but now in southern Sweden. His parents, Atte Brahe and Beate Bile, belonged to prominent noble families within Danish society. The Brahe and the Bile lineages were well established among the aristocracy, granting Tycho a position of wealth and social standing from birth. Atte Brahe served as a nobleman and privy councillor, reflecting the family's involvement in political and court life. Tycho was the eldest surviving son, though he had a twin brother who was stillborn, which we will talk about more later. He also had several other siblings, though his early separation from his biological family altered his relationship with them. A significant turning point in Tycho's family life occurred at the age of 2, when his childless uncle, Jørgen Brahe, and aunt, Inger Ox, took him into their care. This arrangement, often described as a quasi-adoption, was likely an agreement between the families rather than a hostile act. Jørgen Brahe, a vice admiral and nobleman, and Inger, noted for her intelligence and interest in science and humanities, raised Tycho in their castle at Tustrup. This provided him with a much better environment than from his biological parents' household, offering access to resources and education that would later prove crucial to his development. Jørgen Brahe heroically died in 1565 when he rescued King Frederick II of Denmark from drowning and subsequently succumbed to illness. This further elevated the family status and left Tycho with a substantial inheritance. This financial independence allowed him to pursue his interests without the immediate pressures faced by less privileged scholars. Tycho's upbringing under Jørgen and Inger's care was marked by privilege and intellectual stimulation. His aunt's scholarly inclinations may have influenced his curiosity, while his uncle's status ensured a stable and well-connected environment. At around 12 or 13 years old, Tycho was sent to the University of Copenhagen to study law, a common path for young noblemen preparing for careers in civil service. However, his trajectory shifted dramatically in 1560 when, at the age of 14, he observed a partial solar eclipse. This event ignited his fascination with astronomy, prompting him to study the subject independently by acquiring books and instruments, even as he continued his formal education in law. In 1562, Tycho traveled to the University of Leipzig in Germany to further his studies. Though enrolled to pursue law, he devoted much of his time to mathematics and astronomy. During this period, in 1563, he observed a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn and noted discrepancies in existing astronomical tables, fueling his determination to achieve greater precision in celestial observations. Tycho's academic journey continued as he briefly attended the University of Wittenberg before moving to the University of Rostock. In 1566, while at Rostock, he ended up in a dispute with another Danish nobleman, leading to a duel that resulted in the loss of part of his nose. For the rest of his life, he wore a prosthetic nose. We will come back to this later. Following Jürgen Brahe's death in 1565, Tycho inherited his uncle's estate, gaining the financial freedom to travel and study further. He visited Basel and Augsburg, where in the latter he designed and constructed a large quadrant for measuring the position of celestial bodies. This instrument reflected his growing commitment to accurate astronomical observation, a hallmark of his later career. After his travels, he returned to Denmark around 1570, briefly considering careers in alchemy or medicine. The death of his father in 1571 provided him with additional inheritance, further securing his resources. How convenient. A pivotal movement came in 1572 when he observed a new star, later identified as a supernova, an event that cemented his dedication to astronomy and marked his transition into a professional scientist. Tycho's family background was rooted in Danish nobility, with his parents Ate Brahe and Beate Bile, and his uncle and aunt Jürgen Brahe and Inger Ox, providing a foundation of wealth, status, and intellectual opportunity. Raised by his uncle and aunt from age 2, Tycho enjoyed a privileged childhood that facilitated his education at prestigious universities across Europe. His earlier years were shaped by a shift from law to astronomy, sparked by the 1560 solar eclipse. Supported by his family resources and his own curiosity, Tycho laid the groundwork for his future astronomical achievements during these formative years. Now we will talk a little bit more in depth about his education and studies. Tycho's formal education was rooted in the expectation of his noble family, but his interest in astronomy emerged early and grew through self-directed efforts. His academic journey took him across several prestigious universities in Europe. Again, the University of Copenhagen from 1559 to 1562. At the age of 13, Brahe enrolled at the University of Copenhagen to study law and philosophy. His family, particularly his uncle Jürgen Brahe, who raised him, intended him to pursue a career in law or public service. And then we have the University of Leipzig from 1562 to 1565. In 1562, Brahe was sent to the university in Germany to continue his legal studies. Despite this, he secretly pursued astronomy under the guidance of Valentine Thau, a professor of astronomy. During this period, he began making his own observation and even constructed a small globe to aid his studies, demonstrating his growing independence in the field. And then we have the University of Wittenberg at 1565. In 1565, Brahe briefly attended the university where he studied under Caspar Peucer, a scholar who supported the Copernican heliocentric model. This exposure to the idea that the Earth orbited the Sun was a significant departure from the dominant geocentric view and left a lasting impression on Brahe, even though he did not fully adopt it. And then we have the University of Rostock from 1566 to 1568. Later in 1566, Brahe transferred to the university, where he continued his studies till 1568, and while he was there, he deepened his astronomical knowledge through self-study, further distancing himself from legal education. After completing his formal education, Brahe traveled through Europe, visiting scholars and acquiring books and instruments. These travels exposed him to a broader scientific community, including figures like Peter Ramus and Johannes Praetorius, Praetorius, and this helped enrich his understanding of astronomy beyond university curricula offered. Despite his formal training in law, Brahe was largely self-taught in astronomy, relying on books, personal observations, and instruments he built himself. His noble birth and the resources provided by his family gave him the freedom to pursue this passion, culminating in his later establishment of the Uraniborg Observatory. Tycho was deeply influenced by Renaissance humanism and the revival of classical knowledge. His astronomical thought was shaped by Ptolemy, and his astrology drew from Tetrabiblos. But his views were not purely classical. He was also deeply influenced by the writings of Paracelsus, the Swiss alchemist and medical reformer. From Paracelsus, Tycho inherited an interest in the healing properties of metals, the philosophy of nature, and the idea that celestial bodies influence health and fate. Tycho embraced Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, worldviews that saw the cosmos as an interconnected whole alive with symbolic meaning. To Tycho, astronomy was a way to read the language of God. Astrology was the interpretation of divine messages. In 1576, Tycho received a royal grant in the island of Hven from King Frederick II of Denmark. There he built Uraniborg, a state-of-the-art observatory, research center, and alchemical laboratory. Uraniborg was more than a scientific center. It was a blueprint for Renaissance science, precise, interdisciplinary, and steeped in symbolism. Tycho designed instruments of unprecedented accuracy, including giant quadrants and sextants. He tracked the stars and planets by naked eye, often assisted by his team of apprentices and scholars. Uraniborg also featured an alchemical lab, herb garden, printing press, and underground observatory called Stjerneborg. It was a self-contained world of science and symbolism. Alchemy was also central to Tycho's worldview. He wasn't trying to turn lead into gold, he was exploring the deeper nature of substances. His work in iotrochemistry or chemical medicine followed Paracelsian principles. He prepared herbal and mineral remedies, often using astrological charts to determine timing. He believed the macrocosm, the universe, reflected the microcosm, the human body. Planetary alignments affected health, temperament, and the course of disease. At Uraniborg, Tycho mixed astronomical observation with alchemical theory, not as contradiction, but as a complement. Brahe's astronomical career was shaped by a mix of personal experiences, academic mentors, and the scientific debates of his time. Now we're going to take some time to talk about the people and events that impacted and influenced Tycho's life. Again, witnessing the 1560 solar eclipse at age 13 was a defining moment for Brahe. The event demonstrated that celestial phenomena could be predicted with precision, sparking his curiosity and showing him the practical power of astronomical knowledge. This inspired him to study the skies beyond his formal legal education. His professors and mentors, Valentine Thau and Caspar Peucer, were a big influence. Again, Valentine Thau was in Leipzig. He was a professor of astronomy. Thau provided Brahe with early formal instruction in the field. Thau's teachings gave Brahe the foundational skills to begin his own observation, bridging the gap between his legal studies and his astronomical interests. Caspar Peucer, in Wittenberg, introduced Brahe to the Copernican heliocentric model. This exposure challenged the traditional geocentric view and influenced Brahe's later development of a hybrid model, where planets orbited the sun, but the sun orbited the Earth. Also witnessing the 1572 supernova, that influenced Brahe's observation of a new star, now recognized as a supernova, in 1572 was a groundbreaking discovery. It contradicted the Aristotelian belief that the heavens were unchanging, reinforcing his commitment to observation-based astronomy. This event solidified his belief that empirical evidence could challenge established theories. When I had satisfied myself that no star of any of the known planets was situated in that place in the sky, I knew that a new star had really been born. That is from the De Nova Stella on the New Star from 1573, about the supernova of 1572. Works of Ptolemy and Copernicus also influenced Tycho. Brahe studied Ptolemy's geocentric model, which placed the Earth at the center of the universe. Ptolemy's detailed observations were a benchmark for Brahe, but he recognized flaws in the model's accuracy, motivating him to improve upon it. Copernicus influenced him as well. Copernicus's heliocentric model, published in 1543, proposed that the Earth and planets orbited the Sun. While Brahe admired its elegance, he was skeptical of its full implications. This tension led him to create his own system, blending elements of both models. Brahe's frustration with inaccuracies in existing astronomical tables drove him to conduct meticulous observations. He believed that resolving debates between geocentric and heliocentric models required better data. This conviction led him to build advanced instruments and establish Uraniborg, where he compiled observations that later aided Johannes Kepler's work. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about Tycho's medical practices and influences. Medicine was also a practical necessity for Tycho. His noble status included responsibility for the well-being of the people on his estate, especially on the island of Hven. He ran a functioning laboratory and pharmacy at his observatory, basically an alchemical laboratory for distillation and chemical processing. There was also an herbal garden for growing medicinal plants. This is where he prepared remedies for illness such as the plague and epilepsy. He used the Paracelsian methods to prepare tinctures, elixirs, and compound remedies from metals and herbs. Tycho developed medicines for the plagues and fevers, epilepsy, and skin and venereal diseases. His most famous compound was a type of theriac, a complex antidote made from Theriaca or Theriaca andromachi, an ancient antidote from Galenic tradition, alcohol, sulfur, myrrh, saffron, aloes, and more. He provided the Emperor Rudolf with one preparation against epidemic diseases, of which the principal ingredient was that compound. The inventor was Andromachus the Elder, court physician to the Roman Emperor Nero, mid the 1st century CE. And the core ingredients could be up to around 60 items. Viper flesh, opium, cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense, various roots, resins, all sorts of stuff, all bound with honey into a thick mixture. It was first and foremost marketed as a counterpoison against snakebite, a scorpion sting, or deliberate poisoning. Patients took it prophylactically, a pea-sized bolus daily, as a curative dissolved in wine or water. It was also used for plague and fevers. During late antique and Black Death epidemics, it was dispersed as a cordial medicine, believed to drive off corrupt airs, strengthen the heart, and stimulate sweating. It was also a digestive and hepatic tonic. Medical writers from Galen to Avicenna note its warming, carminative action, prescribed for colic, flatulent, weak digestion, and sluggish cold livers. The sizable opium content made it popular for aching joints, persistent coughs, and insomnia, roughly the role later played by laudanum. The general panacea or restorative apothecaries sold it, often at great cost, as a luxury and mixture to fortify the spirits, aid convalescence, and combat age-related decline. Physicians might add a little to almost any syrup. These remedies Tycho prescribed were distributed free of charge to the inhabitants of Hven, and Tycho reportedly treated many people himself. Tycho kept most of his recipes secret, sharing them only with trusted nobles and royalty, such as Emperor Rudolf II. He refused to publish his medical writings, fearing scrutiny by the church or ridicule from other scholars. Tycho was one of the first figures to merge astronomy, alchemy, and medicine in a methodical way. He employed empirical techniques, careful observation, and experimentation, just as he did in astronomy. Some of Tycho's medicines were used until the 19th century and were included in Danish pharmacopoeias. Some of them are, and some of these names, Elixir Tychonis, often Elixir Nobilis Dani, or as Tycho named it, Elixir ad pestum and malignus febris, was an alcoholic diaphoretic to provoke sweating in plague and smallpox, or English sweating sickness. And then we have aqua ad morbum epidemicum, aqua Instagram epidemicum. That's so weird. Aqua Instagram epidemicum was an aromatic spirit distilled from juniper wood, rosemary, sage, taken daily or sprinkled in rooms as a cleanser during epidemics. It was reprinted verbatim in Bartholin's Systema Medica and then in the National Pharmacopoeia as a prophylactic epidemic water. And then we have aqua contra febris, and that was a cooling febrifuge made by double distillation of willow, meadowsweet, violets, nitrate, and a little spirit of vitriol. It was adopted in dispensatorium Hafnins and carried over unchanged in 1772 to 1805 in the Pharmacopoeia Danica, and that was listed until 1863. We also have Pulvis mercurialis tychonis, and that was a basic mercuric sulfate calcined with nitrate and antimony. Powerful emetic and cathartic, and it was also blown up the nose. Dispensatorium Hafnins kept Tycho's exact recipe, but from 772, the Pharmacopoeia Danica simply listed turbith mineral as an official substance. The name Tychi mineralis lingered in apothecary catalogs until 1893. Interesting fun fact, the recent chemical analysis of glass shards from Uraniborg showed traces of mercury, antimony, copper, zinc, and even tungsten. These match ingredients he likely used for epilepsy and infectious diseases. Though not widely recognized for medicine during his life, he was known as a respected healer in his region. His remedies were requested by royal patrons and nobles. Modern historians and chemists recognize him as a serious and early practitioner of chemical medicine. Some of the people who helped shape Tycho's medical thinking are, again, Paracelsus, a radical Swiss physician and alchemist who rejected classical medical authorities like Allen and emphasized chemical treatments over bloodletting or humoral balance. Paracelsus viewed the human body as a microcosm that mirrored the macrocosm, the universe. Tycho embraced this idea and believed celestial bodies influenced human health, leading him to combine astronomy with medicine. There was also Levinus Battus, a professor of medicine at the University of Rostock, where Tycho studied. He was a Paracelsian, and Tycho likely attended his lectures on medical chemistry and the preparation of plant-based medicines. He was also a fan of Cornelius Gemmer, a contemporary physician and astronomer who also worked to combine astrology, astronomy, and medicine. Tycho exchanged ideas with Gemmer on how celestial phenomena related to bodily health and disease. Tycho Brahe's work in medicine reflects the interdisciplinary nature of Renaissance science. He wasn't just an astronomer, but a Paracelsian physician, practicing alchemist, scientific herbalist, and a public health provider on his estate. Though he is remembered primarily for his contributions to astronomy, Tycho's chemical medicinal legacy reveals him as a pioneer of early scientific medicine and a transitional figure bridging medieval healing traditions with modern scientific approaches. Now, we're going to get a little off topic and talk a bit about Tycho's personal life. Here's the story of how Tycho lost part of his nose. Tycho lost part of his nose in a dramatic sword duel in 1566 when he was just 20 years old. At the time, he was a student at the University of Rostock in Germany. Unlike many duels of the era, which were often fought over matters of honor or romance, this confrontation had an unusual cause, a disagreement over a mathematical problem. Tycho was turning it up. Brahe's adversary was Mandra Parsberg, a fellow student and distant relative. Both young men were known for their strong personalities, and their dispute arose from a heated debate about who was the superior mathematician. Unable to settle the matter through discussion, they resorted to the customs of the time and agreed to a duel with swords to resolve their intellectual rivalry. The duel took place on December 29, 1566. During the encounter, Parsberg landed a precise blow, striking Brahe across the face and severing part of his nose. The injury was significant, leaving Brahe permanently disfigured. This event reflects not only fiery temperament for which Brahe was known, but also the culture of dueling prevalent among students in the 16th century Europe, where even academic disputes could escalate into physical confrontations. To deal with this disfigurement, Brahe wore a prosthetic nose for the rest of his life. Popular stories often claim it was made of gold or silver materials befitting his noble status, but recent studies suggest it was more likely crafted from brass. The prosthetic served both a cosmetic purpose, maintaining his public appearance, and a practical one, covering the wound left by the duel. Now we will get back to his works, observations, and accomplishments. The observation of 1572 supernova. In November of 1572, Brahe noticed a brilliant new star in the constellation Cassiopeia. He called it a nova, Latin for new, and tracked it for 18 months as it shone brightly, visible even in daylight, before fading. Using precise measurements, Brahe determined that this star showed no detectable parallax, apparent shift due to the Earth's position, proving it was far beyond the moon among the fixed stars. This was later identified as a supernova, now known as SN 1572. The discovery contradicted the Aristotelian view that the heavens were unchanged and eternal. It showed that new objects could appear in the supposed immutable celestial sphere, shaking the foundations of ancient cosmology. Brahe meticulously observed comets, especially the Great Comet of 1577, recording their position and paths across the sky over several months. He found that comets exhibited no measurable parallax, meaning they were located far beyond the moon's orbit. This placed them in the celestial realm, not the atmosphere as Aristotle had claimed. By proving comets were astronomical rather than meteorological phenomena, Brahe further undermined the Aristotelian model and reinforced the idea that the heavens were dynamic and subject to change. Over 2 decades, Brahe recorded the positions of planets with a particular focus on Mars, using large, custom-made instruments like quadrants and sextants. His observations were extraordinarily accurate, with errors as small as 1 arcminute, 1/60th of a degree. He tracked planetary motions relative to the fixed stars, creating a vast dataset. This data was later used by Johannes Kepler, Brahe's assistant, to formulate his 3 laws of planetary motion. These laws, which describe elliptical orbits, were pivotal in confirming the heliocentric model of the solar system. Brahe proposed a hybrid solar system model where the planets orbited the sun, but the sun and moon orbited the Earth. This Tychonic system blended elements of Ptolemy's geocentric model and Copernicus's heliocentric model, aligning with Brahe's observations while preserving Earth's central position. Though ultimately incorrect, the model was a practical compromise that explained many observed planetary motions. It gained traction in an era when heliocentrism faced religious and philosophical resistance, serving as a stepping stone to later theories. Tycho also compiled a catalog of over 1,000 stars, measuring their celestial coordinates, right ascension and declination, using his advanced instruments. His catalog was far more accurate than earlier ones, like Ptolemy's, with positional errors often within 1 arcminute for many stars. This work became a standard reference for astronomers for centuries, showcasing the value of systematic observation and providing a baseline for studying stellar positions over time. Brahe invented the equatorial armillary sphere, an instrument with rings representing the celestial equator, ecliptic, and other key circles, used to measure celestial coordinates. This tool allowed for far more precise tracking of stars and planets as they moved across the sky, surpassing earlier instruments in accuracy. This sphere exemplified Brahe's innovative approach to instrumentation, significantly improving the quality of astronomical observations. And then we have the establishment of Uraniborg and Stjerneborg observatories. Uraniborg is not a palace for princes, but a temple for the stars. Here, far from the noise of the court, the stars speak freely. Brahe constructed 2 observatories on the island of Hven, Denmark. Uraniborg, completed in 1580, and Stjerneborg completed 1584. These were equipped with cutting-edge instruments like large quadrants and armillary spheres. Stjerneborg's underground design reduced wind and vibration interference, enabling even more precise instruments. These facilities were among the first dedicated astronomical research centers in Europe, setting a precedent for modern observatories and fostering systematic long-term study of the skies. Brahe also tried to detect stellar parallax, the apparent shift in a star's position due to the Earth's orbit around the Sun, using his precise instruments. He couldn't measure any parallax as the effect was too small to detect without a telescope due to the immense distance to stars. His failure to find parallax led him to reject the heliocentric model, but it highlighted the need for greater precision. This question was resolved later when telescopes confirmed parallax, validating Copernicus's ideas. After Brahe's death in 1601, his assistant Johannes Kepler inherited his extensive observational records, particularly the Mars data. Kepler used Brahe's data to derive his 3 laws of planetary motion, which describe elliptical orbits and their mathematical relationship. This work was a turning point in astronomy, confirming the heliocentric model and cementing Brahe's legacy as a foundational figure. Brahe's work bridged ancient and modern astronomy, combining rigorous observation with innovative tools. His legacy lies in his precision, his challenge to dogma, and his role in paving the way for scientific revolution. Now, before we get too far into this episode, I would like to take time to talk about Uraniborg and Stjerneborg. Tycho, armed with royal patronage and a craftsman obsession for precision, set out to build not merely a residence, but a Renaissance microcosmos where gardens, laboratories, and observatories converged in geometric harmony. In this unlikely sanctuary, the massive quadrants, armillary spheres, and sextants he forged would harvest starlight with a rigor no one had yet attempted, while underground chambers cradled instruments so delicately poised that even the island's sea breeze cannot disturb them. It is to these twin marvels, Uraniborg, the castle of Urania, and its steadfast sibling, Stjerneborg, the star castle, sunk into bedrock, tracing how their architecture, instruments, and daily rhythms wove together the most accurate naked-eye astronomy the world has ever seen. Uraniborg was constructed between 1576 and 1580 with royal funding and oversight by architect Hans van Steenwinckel the Elder, a Flemish-Danish architect, in cooperation with Tycho. Tycho envisioned Uraniborg as a scholarly palace and observatory. It served not only his own work, but hosted students and assistants from across Europe, effectively becoming a research institute as much as a private castle. Tycho's sister, Sophia Brahe, and other aides helped with observations and calculations, and over 30 research assistants worked there during its heyday. Tycho also pursued alchemy, meteorology, and astrology on Hven, reflecting the Renaissance idea of uniting various sciences. In 1584 to 1586, Tycho added the smaller observatory, Stjerneborg, Castle of the Stars, adjacent to Uraniborg when he realized that some of his large instruments were unstable in Uraniborg's upper floors due to wind and vibrations. Stjerneborg, completed in 1586, was dedicated purely to observation and built largely underground to give instruments a firmer anchor in the bedrock, thereby improving their accuracy. Together, Uraniborg and Stjerneborg formed the centerpiece of Tycho's scientific enterprise on Hven, operating from 1576 until 1597. In 1597, Tycho fell out of favor with the new king, Christian IV, and was forced to leave Denmark. Shortly after his death in 1601, the observatories were abandoned and eventually demolished by the Danish crown, marking an end to this remarkable chapter in pre-telescopic astronomy. Now we're going to get into the architecture and the layout of the Castle of Urania, which I think you might find really interesting. Uraniborg was designed as a small palace that elegantly blended domestic residence with scientific functionality. Externally, it was a square brick mansion about 15 meters on each side, built in the Northern Renaissance style with decorative sandstone and limestone trim. Two semicircular towers projected from the north and south walls, giving the building a rectangular footprint overall. The name Uraniborg literally means Castle of Urania, and Tycho deliberately orientated and proportioned the building and gardens according to geometric grids, possibly believing the harmonious proportions would act as an astrological talisman to bless the research within. The construction was overseen by architect Hans van Steenwickel and sculptor Johann Gregor van der Schaard, incorporating elaborate iconography and inscriptions reflecting the astronomical purpose. Uraniborg had 3 main stories plus a basement, each level serving distinct purposes. The ground floor featured a residential suite and workspace for Tycho, his family, and visiting scholars. It was divided into 4 rooms, one occupied by Tycho's family and the others for visiting astronomers. The north tower on this level housed the kitchen, while the south tower held Tycho's personal library, which bore the engraved motto, Non habere sed esse, to be rather than to be seen, a humanist sentiment reminding scholars to seek true substance over appearance. The second floor was dedicated to astronomical observation. The 2 round towers here served as an enclosed observatories containing Tycho's principal instruments, which could be accessed from indoor doorways or from outside platforms. Balconies encircled the towers, supported by wooden posts, allowing additional instruments to be mounted slightly away from the walls for a wider view of the sky. A special royal apartment was also on the second floor for VIP guests. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, stayed there in 1590. The third floor was a loft divided into 8 small rooms to lodge Tycho's students and assistants, reflecting Uraniborg's role as an early research center attracting trainees from many countries. Above the loft rose a small central observatory turret, which offered a 360 view. Tycho could ascend to this rooftop platform for observations, and it was topped by a gilded Pegasus wind vane as a symbol of poetic inspiration. Lastly, beneath the castle lay a large basement, half of which Tycho outfitted as an alchemical laboratory, complete with furnaces and distillation equipment. The other half served as a storage for food, fuel, and supplies to support the self-sufficient estate. Notably, Tycho even included a tiny jail cell in the basement to detain unruly island tenants or servants if needed. A reminder that as a feudal lord of Hven, he governed the island's inhabitants in addition to conducting science. Uraniborg's building stood at the center of a meticulously planned Renaissance garden complex. Tycho surrounded the main house with a formal walled garden laid out in geometric patterns, squares and circular paths. Initially, he intended to fortify the compound with a thick brick wall 75 meters on a side and 5.5 meters high. But this was never completed. Instead, an earthen rampart or mound was heaped around the perimeter, forming a square earthwork that partially shielded the observatory from winds. Inside the enclosure, Tycho cultivated herb gardens and orchids in each quadrant around the house. The gardens were both ornamental and practical. Tycho, interested in medicine, grew medicinal herbs for his chemical and alchemical experiments, and the neat beds also reflected the cosmic order he sought to discern. Contemporary accounts describe hundreds of fruit trees and even recreational features like small pavilions and game courts within the grounds. At the east and west entrances of the compound stood gatehouse pavilions. Tycho used one as a printing workshop to publish his own astronomical books on site, and another as quarters for staff or even kennels for guard dogs to alert against intruders. Tycho also engineered water supply and craft production on the island. He constructed fish ponds and drainage ditches across Hven, channeling water to power a paper mill near the shore, which supplied paper for his printing press. Uraniborg, thus, was more than a house. It was a self-contained scientific estate with observatories, laboratories, gardens, workshops, and living quarters integrated into one visionary complex. Now, we're going to focus on Stjerneborg, Tycho's underground observatory for precision. By the mid-1580s, Tycho Brahe's drive for even more precise measurements led him to build Stjerneborg, a specialized observatory just a few hundred meters from Uraniborg. Unlike the towering Uraniborg, Stjerneborg was largely subterranean, addressing a key problem Tycho had encountered. His huge instruments mounted in Uraniborg's upper rooms were susceptible to wind and slight building movements, which introduced observational errors. Stjerneborg, meaning Star Castle, was constructed in 1584 to 1586 as a low-profile ground-level facility purely dedicated to astronomy. It had no grand house above it. Essentially, it was an array of instrument vaults built into the ground and covered with small domes or shutters. Tycho designed Stjerneborg to give his instruments solid foundations on the bedrock beneath Hven's sandy soil, thereby greatly increasing stability and accuracy. This site was laid out with a similar geometric plan to Uraniborg, but at a more modest scale. A small square enclosure with an earth embankment and perhaps a few outbuildings. Some period illustrations show a pattern of 5 little cupolas or roof structures corresponding to the instrument chambers below. In fact, 5 underground chambers were built, each housing a single large instrument mounted on masonry piers and metal frames anchored in the earth. Above each chamber, an opening to the sky could be closed off by either a pair of wooden shutters or a rotating dome to protect the instruments when not observing. This design allowed observations to be done essentially indoors at ground level. Observers could work in each pit with their instruments sheltered from wind and weather, looking up through the open hatch at the target star or planet. Stjerneborg's construction was technically innovative. Tycho himself likely oversaw the engineering, integrating instrument and architecture. Each observation room had a steeped, bowl-shaped floor, so the instrument space sat low and stable, and the observer could move around to sight along it. Iron supports were built into the walls to brace the instruments rigidly in 3 dimensions. For example, the chamber for Tycho's great equatorial armillary sphere included a sturdy iron framework bolted into the masonry, forming a cradle that held the instrument's polar axis firmly in alignment. This entire arrangement minimized flex and wobble. While Uraniborg had used removable tower roofs for viewing, Stjerneborg's flush hatches provided even better protection from gusts. Tycho also attempted to connect Stjerneborg to Uraniborg via an underground tunnel, but this tunnel was never completed. Still, Stjerneborg's functioned in tandem with Uraniborg. Tycho often ran parallel observation at both sites, using data from one to check the others in order to eliminate instrumental errors. Uraniborg was outfitted with the most advanced astronomical instruments of the late 16th century, all designed for naked eye observation. Tycho, a skilled instrument maker, continuously innovated to improve precision. All of Tycho's instruments were operated without telescopic optics. They relied on naked eye sightings using mechanical sights. To enhance accuracy, Tycho introduced technical innovations. He improved the traditional pinhole sights by using a peg and slit sighting system. One sight had a tiny slit and the opposite sight had a fine peg or wire so that the observer would line up the star exactly between the peg as seen through the slit. This produced a sharper line of sight than a simple circular hole, reducing parallax error in the observer's eye. He also employed highly refined gradations on his scales, even devising new methods to subdivide degrees into minutes of arc and fractions thereof by transversals, so readings could be interpolated very finely. Tycho was obsessed with calibration. He would regularly compare observations of the same object made with different instruments to detect any offsets. In practice, he often used multiple devices for the same measurement and averaged the results to eliminate random errors. Thanks to these measures, the precision Tycho achieved was astonishing for pre-telescope astronomy. Again, his best observations were accurate to within 1 arc minute, 1/60th of a degree, roughly 10 times better than the previous generation of astronomers. Modern analysis of Tycho's observing logbooks found that many of his instruments had a typical error of only 30 to 50 arc seconds, limited mainly by human factor of reading the scale. Such accuracy would not be significantly surpassed until the use of telescopic sights in the 17th and 18th century. While Uraniborg housed most of Tycho's instruments initially, Stjerneborg was created to host a select few of his largest and most advanced instruments under optimal conditions. Among the instruments deployed at Stjerneborg were the Great Equatorial Armory Sphere. Completed around 1585, this was Tycho's masterwork. A massive armory sphere about 9 feet in diameter designed for measuring star positions in the equatorial coordinate system. It improved on his earlier armories by mounting the polar axis firmly in the ground and using a reduced ring structure to minimize weight and flex. This equatorial armory's sheer size and stable installation in Stjerneborg allowed Tycho to observe faint stars with greater precision and to systematically account for atmospheric refraction. Tycho considered this instrument the crowning achievement of his instrumental arsenal, and with it, he scrutinized the motion of the stars and planets to an unprecedented degree. For instance, in 1587, he intensely used the Great Armory to attempt a measurement of the parallax of Mars, the apparent shift of Mars' position at opposition. Although the technology of the time and imperfect refraction tables prevented a conclusion detection of Mars' parallax, these observations were critical in yielding the most precise orbit data of the era. Although the technology of the time prevented a conclusive detection of Mars' parallax, these observations were critical in yielding the most precise Mars orbit data of the era. Then we have the large azimuthal quadrant. Tycho installed a heavy altitude quadrant in one of Stjerneborg's chambers, often referred to as the Great Zenith Quadrant or Great Azimuth Quadrant. This instrument, depicted in Tycho's illustrations, had a radius of several feet. Some sources describe a 1.55 meter diameter quadrant in Stjerneborg. It was likely constructed of brass and iron, fixed on a central pivot with the arc along the perimeter of the pit. This quadrant allowed Tycho to measure star altitudes with extreme care and also determine their azimuth, using a circular scale on the floor of the observing cell. The stable underground location eliminated the wobble he had encountered with the tower-mounted quadrants. Tycho's star catalog benefited from these high-accuracy meridian altitude measurements. Stjerneborg also hosted at least one great sextant, or perhaps Tycho's improved triagonal sextant, likely a sturdy metal frame sextant used for measuring angles between stars across the sky. Tycho's notes and the later inventory by his biographer Dreyer indicate that a 6-foot radius steel quadrant and a large sextant were among the equipment installed in the subterranean observatory. Each was custom mounted in its own chamber. One chamber's instruments could even be used to observe circumpolar stars continuously by rotating around. Another chamber might have held a telescope-like pinhole camera obscura for solar observations. While details on every Stjerneborg instruments are scarce, we know 5 instruments in total were housed there, each under its own hatch. Operating these instruments at Stjerneborg followed similar principles as at Uraniborg, but with improved comfort and accuracy. Observers would stand in the pit room, often in near darkness except for starlight, aligning the sights of the instrument on a celestial target through the open roof. Assistants with lanterns or perhaps luminescent paint would then help read off the angles on the graduated scales. Tycho's team could work sheltered from wind and even continue observing in winter cold more effectively by closing the hatches when not sighting. The results were excellent. Stjerneborg yielded some of the most precise data of the age, essentially confirming and refining the measurements taken at Uraniborg. Tycho Brahe's departure from Hven in 1597 marked the end of Uraniborg and Stjerneborg's active life. Lacking Tycho's leadership and royal favor, the facilities fell into neglect. After Tycho's sudden death in 1601, the new King Christian IV, who had been hostile to Tycho, ordered the demolition of the Hven observatories. Uraniborg, which had been costly to maintain, it's estimated to have consumed about 1% of Denmark's state budget during its construction, was torn down by locals recycling its bricks, and Stjerneborg's above-ground structures were likewise dismantled. By the mid-17th century, only ruins and earthen mound remained on the wind-swept island. For centuries, the site languished, but in the 20th century, Denmark and later Sweden renewed interest in Tycho's legacy. A Tycho Brahe museum was established on Hven in the 1930s. In the 1950s, archaeologists undertook systematic excavations of Uraniborg and Stjerneborg. They uncovered the foundation walls of Uraniborg's cellar and mapped out the layout of the castle, confirming the dimensions and locations of towers, wells, etc. At Stjerneborg, the team exposed the underground observatory intact masonry. The instrument pits, stairways, and mounting bases were revealed. To preserve these remains, a protective concrete dome was built over Stjerneborg's central portion in 1957, later replaced by a low brick vault structure. Today, visitors can descend into the partially reconstructed Stjerneborg chambers, where the replicas of Tycho's instruments stand in their original positions. A multimedia show projects stars on the chamber ceilings and narrates Tycho's nightly routine, bringing the 16th century science to life. This immersive installation gives a vivid impression of how Tycho and his assistants observed in the cold, dark pits of Stjerneborg 4 centuries ago. Meanwhile, the Uraniborg site above ground has been turned into an open-air historical park. Based on archaeological findings and Tycho's own descriptions, a section of Uraniborg's castle footings and gardens has been restored. One quadrant of the Renaissance herb garden was replanted in the 1990s with period-appropriate plants and herbs, laid out in box beds exactly as Tycho had them, thanks to seeds found on site and analysis of Brahe's writings. The earth mound outlines of the fortress are still visible encircling the site, and a portion of the mound and ramparts was reconstructed to its original height to give a sense of scale. Within the old Uraniborg footprint, low walls now mark the location of the castle. In the center of the garden, an orchid pavilion with fruit trees has been planted, echoing Tycho's original orchards. The nearby Tycho Brahe Museum itself is housed in a restored 16th century church on Hven and contains exhibits about Tycho's life. It displays full-size replicas of Brahe's instruments. Interactive models and panels explain how Uraniborg lurked and operated. There is even a scale model of the solar system path outside, with distances between planet markers proportional to Tycho's cosmology, allowing guests to walk the planets. Through these preservation and reconstruction efforts, the island of Hven today serves as a unique historic site commemorating Tycho's achievements. The legacy of Uraniborg and Stjerneborg is not only visible in the ruins and replicas, but also in their impact on science. They are celebrated as the first modern observatories in Europe, a place where, as one museum sign puts it, Hven became a brilliant center of European science in Tycho's era. The data produced here fundamentally changed astronomy and led directly to the work of Kepler and ultimately Newton's law of gravitation. Visitors walking among the herb gardens and peering into the subterranean Stjerneborg can appreciate how Tycho Brahe's determination to methodically chart the heavens with the aid of advanced instruments paved the way for a new worldview. In sum, Uraniborg and Stjerneborg on the island of Hven represent a remarkable fusion of architecture, science, and art. A Renaissance observatory castle and its underground adjunct, built to pursue the secrets of the stars and whose influence is still felt in the foundation of modern astronomy. Now, before we move on to discuss Tycho's alchemical practices, we're going to talk about Jepp. And who's Jepp? Tycho Brahe's court dwarf. In this milieu of empirical inquiry and curious extravagance, one of the most colorful figures in Tycho's household was Jepp, the resident court dwarf. Jepp, also spelled J-E-P or L-E-P-P-E in some sources, was a little person, a man with dwarfism, who lived and served in Tycho Brahe's household at Uraniborg. Contemporary accounts refer to him as Brahe's fool or court jester. Beyond a few descriptions, however, very little is known about Jepp's own life. He is effectively no more than a footnote of history. Even his origins and what became of him after Brahe's tenure on Hven remain unknown. We do not know Jepp's age. Some later fictional portrayals imagine him as a teenager, though this is speculative, or how he came to be in Tycho's service. What we have are a handful of anecdotes preserved in letters and biographies after Brahe's death, which paint Jeppe as an endlessly chattering dwarf whom Tycho kept at his estate for amusement and perhaps for something more mystical. Despite the scarcity of biographical detail, historians generally accept that Brahe did indeed have a dwarf jester named Jeppe in his employ. He is mentioned by Brahe's contemporaries and later chroniclers, though always in relation to Brahe rather than an independent figure. In essence, Jeppe's identity in this historical record is defined by his role in Tycho's household, a role that straddles the lines between fact and legends, as we will explore now. Sources from Brahe's era portray Jeppe as more than a mere entertainer. According to Tycho's pupil Christian Longomontanus, the dwarf was believed to possess second sight, a kind of clairvoyant ability. During meals at Uraniborg, Jeppe sat at Tycho's feet, often literally under the dinner table, receiving food scraps from his hand. He would babble incessantly, but his strange utterances were taken seriously if they seemed prophetic. Brahe's assistants and family listened attentively whenever Jeppe went into a trance-like pronouncement. Several striking anecdotes illustrate Jeppe's reputed powers. On one occasion, Brahe had sent 2 assistants to Copenhagen. On the very day they were expected to return, Jeppe suddenly piped up during supper. "See how your people are washing themselves in the sea." Alarmed, Tycho interpreted this as a vision of a shipwreck. He dispatched a lookout to the shore, and indeed a capsized boat was soon spotted with 2 dripping wet men, just as Jeppe's cryptic remark had implied. In another oft-repeated story, whenever someone fell ill on Hven, Jeppe would pronounce whether they would recover or die, and he was always proven correct. These pronouncements earned him a reputation as a seer. Even the prankish sight of Tycho's students intersected with Jeppe's sight. If the young scholars were slacking off in Tycho's absence, they would post Jeppe as a lookout. When the dwarf sensed or spotted his master returning unexpectedly, he would call out a warning. "Junker par landed. The squire is on the land," giving the other times to look busy. In this way, Jeppe served as both jester and unwitting guardian of discipline. By all accounts, Tycho Brahe valued Jeppe's peculiar talents. One source notes that Tycho kept him for these skills and appeared to take his prophecies seriously. Brahe's diary and scientific writings do not mention Jeppe, but the private respect he offered the dwarf's predictions suggests that Brahe, despite being a pioneering empiricist, was not immune to the era's mystical mindset. At the very least, Jeppe provided entertainment and conversation. At times, he may have offered Brahe counsel or omens of a sort that conventional advisors could not. We should note, the more fantastical aspect of these stories, a 100% success rate in predicting illnesses outcomes, for example, invite skepticism. Nevertheless, they were recorded by people close to Brahe and have become part of the lore of Uraniborg. It is important to distinguish confirmed facts about Jeppe from later embellishments. The primary references to Jeppe come not from Brahe himself, but those who documented Brahe's life shortly after his death. Pierre Gassendi, a 17th century scholar, wrote a biography of Tycho Brahe in 1654 that includes the tale of Brahe's dwarf. Gassendi, in turn, was relaying information from correspondences with Danish antiquary Ole Worm and others. In these letters, Brahe's one-time assistant, Longomontanus, is cited as the authority for Jeppe's clairvoyance. The chain of transmission appears to be Brahe's contemporaries, told stories of Jeppe, Old Worm gathered these anecdotes, and Gesende published them. Albeit with minor errors, he misspelled Jeppe's name as Leppe in one instance. Much later, in 1890, historian J.L.E. Dreyer compiled Brahe's life and included the full Jeppe narrative with references to those earlier sources. Dreyer's biography is the source of many modern retellings and is considered a reliable secondary account of Brahe's life. Thus, the existence of a dwarf jester at Uraniborg and the specific anecdotes about his foresight come to us through credible, if secondhand, historical testimony. What remains unconfirmed are those more sensational aspects. Did Jeppe truly possess paranormal insight, or was his predictions coincidental and then exaggerated by storytellers? Such claims of second sight were not uncommon in folklore, especially regarding court fools or marginalized figures, as we must view them critically. We also lack any independent record of Jeppe's life. For example, we do not know his surname, birth date, or fate. No portrait or direct description of his appearance survives. All we have are the tales of his behavior at Brahe's table. The scarcity of hard evidence is why Catherine Marsh, a modern novelist who researched Jeppe, notes that beyond the few mentioned, little is known about him, including who he was or how he ended up in Uraniborg. Historians generally treat Jeppe's prophetic feats as anecdotal, interesting but not verifiable. The core facts, that Brahe had a dwarf jester named Jeppe who sat under his table and babbled, and that Brahe's circle ascribed psychic powers to him, are well attested. But whether Jeppe actually foresaw events or was simply given retroactive credit for lucky guesses is impossible to know. The reliability of the sources varies, and contemporary like Longomontanus is likely to have met Jeppe, lending some credibility, whereas later writers may have added a dramatic flourish. In sum, Jeppe the person is historical, while Jeppe the seer belongs to the realm of legend and lore. For a figure of scant historical footprint, Jeppe has made a surprisingly large imprint on later culture. Early biographies of Tycho Brahe, like Gesende's and Dreyer's, ensured that the tale of the dwarf jester would be remembered in Brahe's lore. Since then, almost every popular recounting of Brahe's life mentions Jeppe, typically alongside Brahe's other oddities, such as his metal nose and drunken elk. For instance, a 2010 Scientific American piece on Brahe's exhumation quoted Dreyer's description of Jeppe to illustrate the lore surrounding Tycho Brahe. The story captivates because it humanizes and dramatizes the astronomer's image. The idea of a brilliant scientist who kept a psychic dwarf is simply too intriguing to omit. Modern writers have picked up Jeppe's thread and woven it into new narratives. In 2012, Catherine Marsh published Jepp, Who Defied the Stars, a well-received young adult's historical novel that places Jeppe at the center of the story. Marsh took the few known facts, Jeppe's presence at Uraniborg as a teen dwarf jester, and imaginatively filled in a life for him, first in the Spanish Netherlands and then at Brahe's castle. The novel explores themes of fate versus free will, reflecting the very tension between astrology and astronomy in Brahe's time. By making Jeppe a protagonist, Marsh invents his historical role as a footnote, instead giving him an agency and depth while engaging with real figures like Tycho Brahe. This work of fiction underscores how compelling Jeppe's fragmentary story is. Readers and authors are drawn to the what-ifs of his life, how a person of short stature might navigate the grand courts and lofty sciences of the Renaissance. Beyond literature, Jeppe often appears in popular science and history outlets as an anecdote that colorfully encapsulates Brahe's eccentricity. Articles, blogs, and even trivia lists frequently mention that Tycho Brahe had a dwarf jester named Jepp, who he believed to be clairvoyant. Such pieces sometimes embellish the image further, describing Jeppe as Brahe's pet dwarf, or claiming he lived under the table and only popped out to make prophecies, as one tongue-in-cheek account put it. While these popular retellings may sacrifice nuance for humor, they have kept Jepp's memory alive in the public imagination. In a sense, Jepp has achieved a curious kind of immortality. An obscure 16th century dwarf is now regularly cited in anecdotes, from Reddit discussions debunking historical myths to mainstream science podcasts, and now the Occult Rejects, all pondering whether the story of Tycho's clairvoyant dwarf is true. The consensus is that it is true, at least in outline, albeit often retold with a wink. It is often worth noting that Brahe's dwarf has also been conflated with or compared to other legendary figures. Some writers mention Jeppe in the same breath as Brahe's contemporaries at the eccentric court of Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. Rudolf's court was famous for its alchemists, astrologers, and wonders, so a dwarf seer fits right in, though Jeppe himself likely never went to Prague. Jeppe's presence reinforces the milieu of the late Renaissance as one where science, superstition, and spectacle coexisted. Jeppe's presence at Uraniborg exemplifies how Brahe's household blended rationality with the arcane. On one hand, Tycho Brahe relied on precise measurements and data, constructing instruments and catalogs that rejected superstition in astronomy, and on the other hand, he was intrigued by prophecy and the occult qualities of nature. Jeppe's presence at Uraniborg exemplifies how Brahe's household blended rationality with the arcane. On one hand, Tycho Brahe relied on precise measurements and data, constructing instruments and catalogs that rejected superstition in astronomy. For example, he debunked the idea that comets are atmospheric omens, showing they traveled through the heavens. On the other hand, he was intrigued by prophecy and the occult qualities of nature. Having a dwarf who could seemingly foretell events would have appealed to Brahe's philosophical curiosity about the hidden forces in the cosmos. It also accorded with the noble tradition of the court fool whose madness or otherwise gave him license to speak truths. In Brahe's case, the eccentric scientist trusted an unlikely source of knowledge, an illiterate dwarf, alongside his own meticulous observations. This juxtaposition has become a key part of Tycho's legend. The same era that produced heliocentric theory and the scientific method also clung to astrological portents and talismans. Jeppe the Court Dwarf thus lives on as an intriguing fragment of Tycho Brahe's story. A reminder that scientific revolution had its share of strange bedfellows. Historically, Jeppe's biography may be scant, but the legends around him speak volumes about the culture of Brahe's time. In presenting Jeppe's tale, a careful narrative will separate what is known, a dwarf jester at Uraniborg noted for his cryptic pronouncements, from what is lore, his supposed psychic accuracy, all while painting the rich backdrop of Renaissance court life and the psyche of an extraordinary astronomer. Jeppe's presence in Tycho's household is more than a curious anecdote. It highlights the blend of mysticism and empiricism, superstition and science in the late 16th century. It shows how even a figure devoted to measurement and reason could give quarter to the magical and the absurd. In the end, the story of Jeppe and Tycho invites us to ponder the complexities of historical truth versus legend, and to marvel at a moment in history when a dwarf beneath a dinner table could whisper prophecies to a man charting the stars. And as we continue, now we are going to focus on Tycho's alchemical practices, lunar theories, and much more. The alchemists think they can make gold from the basest metals. But I say unto you, it is nobler to extract the truth from error than gold from dirt. Uraniborg, Tycho's observatory palace on Hven, was not only an astronomical center, but also a chemical and alchemical laboratory. Tycho's interest leaned more toward chemical medicine, which was part of Paracelsian alchemy, a practical medical application of alchemical principles. He pursued the transmutation of metals, but more realistically aimed at the refinement and synthesis of medicinal compounds. Tycho and his assistants produced medicines for the poor and for nobles, experimenting with substances like aquavitae, salts, and tinctures. In case you're not sure what aquavitae is, it's an archaic name for a strong aqueous solution of ethanol. He believed that celestial influences, astrology, and terrestrial substances, alchemy, were deeply connected, forming a basis for diagnosis and treatment. Tycho was heavily influenced in alchemy by some of the usual suspects and some you may have never heard of. Of course, Paracelsus, who advocated for using chemical substance to cure illness. He also rejected traditional Galenic medicine and emphasized observation and experiment, aligning with Tycho's empirical spirit. Tycho was also steeped in medieval and Renaissance alchemical texts and works attributed to Gerber, Raymond Lull, and Hermes Trismegistus. These sources influenced his metaphysical beliefs, particularly the idea of correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm, heaven and human. Tycho employed assistants who were also trained in alchemy, like Elias Olsen Morsing. He corresponded with other intellectuals across Europe, many of whom were interested in both alchemy and astronomy, such as John Dee. There is some notable achievements in alchemy for Tycho that are worth mentioning quickly. He built one of the most advanced alchemy labs of the 16th century, comparable in ambition to his astronomical work. He produced medicines distributed both to peasants and aristocrats. And he created a self-sustaining research ecosystem combining astronomy, alchemy, astrology, and weather forecasting. Tycho also spent some time studying the moon. And we're going to touch on some of Brahe's lunar theories now. Tycho systematically recorded lunar positions over decades at his Uraniborg observatory. He wanted to resolve persistent discrepancies in the Ptolemaic tables and to refine the mathematical description of lunar inequalities. From that, there was the discovery of the variation. The variation was discovered by Tycho, who noticed that starting from a lunar eclipse in December 1590, at the times of syzygy, new or full moon, the apparent velocity of the motion of the moon was faster than expected. On the other hand, at times of first and last quarter, its velocity was correspondingly slower than expected. Building on this observation, Tycho quantified the effect's amplitude and period. The variation has a period of half a synodic month and causes the moon's ecliptic longitude to vary by nearly 2/3 of a degree. Tycho's investigations also uncovered oscillations in the moon's orbital plane and nodes. He also discovered librations in the inclination of the plane of the lunar orbit, relative to the ecliptic and accompanying oscillations in the longitude of the lunar node. His work thereby doubled the number of known lunar inequalities, introducing a monthly or semi-annual libration of the nodes in inclination to earlier schemes. Tycho went on to identify a yearly perturbation, the first systematic recognition of the annual equation of the moon. There is also an annual effect, by which the lunar motion slows down a little in January and speeds up a little in July. This finding was later characterized as a variation in the moon's speed tied to the Earth's changing distance from the sun. One of Tycho's most impressive astronomical achievements was his discovery of the moon's so-called annual variation, a variation of the moon's orbital speed associated with the gravitational pull of the sun, which shows a yearly pattern due to the slightly varying distance between the Earth and sun over the course of the year. Tycho's comprehensive lunar theory reduced the discrepancies of lunar models to about a fifth of their previous values, making it the most accurate framework before Newtonian gravitation. As Johannes Kepler later noted, Tycho's lunar theory doubled the number of distinct lunar inequalities and reduced the discrepancies of lunar theory to about a fifth of their previous amounts. It was published by Kepler in 1602, and Kepler's own derivative form appears in Kepler's Rudolphine tables of 1627. By the early 17th century, Tycho's lunar theory, largely refined by his assistant Christian Longomontanus, was recognized as the most advanced and accurate of its era. The meticulous empirical foundation he laid not only transformed lunar astronomy, but also provided the essential data that enabled Kepler's laws, cementing Tycho Brahe's role as a pivotal figure in the scientific revolution. Now we will look at how Tycho viewed and utilized astrology. Not one single tiny spark of truth has yet been found by the strivings of the astrologers. Tycho did not see astrology as separate from astronomy. Instead, he believed that accurate celestial measurements were essential for creating reliable horoscopes and predicting earthly events, a viewpoint common in Renaissance natural philosophy. And what kind of astrology did Tycho practice, you ask? Judicial astrology, focused on interpreting celestial influence on human affairs, births, politics, illnesses, and weather. Mundane astrology, Tycho made predictions about weather, famines, plagues, and political events based on celestial alignments. And then we have medical astrology. He also practiced medicine using star positions to diagnose and treat illness. This overlapped with his alchemy and medicine. He created horoscopes and natal charts. Tycho cast natal charts for nobles, royalty, and himself. He created a detailed horoscope for King Frederick II of Denmark, his patron. He also analyzed the birth charts of historical and mythical figures, comparing their astrological traits with historical records. Before we go any further, let's touch on some of Tycho's astrological influences. Claudius Ptolemy, author of the Tetrabiblos, a foundational text in astrology. Tycho respected Ptolemaic astrology just as he admired Ptolemaic astronomy, even though he modified it. And then Paracelsus, a major influence on Tycho's views about medical astrology. Paracelsus emphasized the influence of celestial bodies on health and disease. He was also influenced by Arabic and medieval astrologers. Tycho drew from traditions shaped by Islamic scholars like Al-Kindi, Al-Bumasar, and Averroes, as well as European medieval astrologers. These sources emphasize both planetary positions and celestial omens. Uraniborg wasn't just a site for astronomical observation, it also housed Tycho's astrological offices. He maintained detailed records of planetary movements specifically for astrological calculations. He produced almanacs and predictions distributed to both the common public and elite clients. Tycho made several predictions regarding European political events, including wars, plagues, and deaths of monarchs. Although not always accurate, these predictions enhanced his reputation at court and secured funding. He used astrology to determine the best times for medical treatments consistent with humoral theory. He also created astrological diagnoses for illnesses, often in conjunction with alchemical remedies. King Frederick II and other nobles valued Tycho's astrological work. His blend of astronomy and astrology made him both a court scientist and a court prophet. The starry vault of heaven is in truth the open book of cosmic projection. This paraphrase captures his approach to astronomy as divine revelation. Now, Tycho wasn't just a master of celestial observation. He also applied that data in practical astrology. He cast horoscopes for nobles, political figures, and even himself. Many of these were used for diagnosis, prognosis, or political predictions. One of them that he did, Tycho Brahe himself. Date of birth, December 14th, 1546 on the Julian calendar. He interpreted his chart as showing a strong Martian influence, possibly reflected in his fiery temperament and resilience, as well as the duel that led to the loss of part of his nose. The horoscope also showed a Saturn-Mars configuration, which Tycho associated with a lifelong pursuit of serious and even secretive knowledge, linking it to his work in alchemy and occult studies. He did the horoscope of King Frederick II of Denmark. Tycho cast and interpreted a nativity chart for his royal patron, King Frederick II. He emphasized planetary placements that suggested noble rulership, military strength, but also personal excess or indulgence, likely based on Jupiter and Venus placements. Tycho used this horoscope to guide medical and political advice to the king, strengthening his standing at court. Tycho attempted to reconstruct birth charts for major historical and religious figures like Christ, Muhammad, and Martin Luther. These charts were not just astrological curiosities. He used them to compare celestial influences across time and explore patterns of destiny and fate. Tycho didn't just cast horoscopes. He also interpreted celestial phenomena such as comets and eclipses as signs of impending events, often of great political or natural consequence. The comet of 1577 was one of Tycho's most important observations. He tracked the comet meticulously and proved that it was far beyond the moon, contradicting Aristotelian cosmology, which said comets were atmospheric. Tycho interpreted the comet as a warning of turmoil, especially political and religious conflict. He connected it with the unrest in the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic-Protestant tensions of the time. He also tied it to potential royal deaths or wars in the coming years. This was consistent with astrological tradition. Comets were omens of change, upheaval, and celestial dissatisfaction. There was also the solar eclipse of 1580, observed across Europe and tracked in great detail by Tycho. Eclipses were considered major omens, especially solar eclipses, which represented a temporary blotting out of power or authority. Tycho interpreted this as a sign of illness or danger to a reigning monarch, possibly Frederick II. He may have tied this eclipse to changes in political alliances and crop failures in certain regions. Then we have the comet of 1590. Less famous than 1577 comet, but Tycho again interpreted it as a sign of impending conflict, possibly tied to the decline of peace in Northern Europe. As usual, he kept detailed observational records alongside interpretive astrological notes. Tycho believed that planets, comets, and eclipses influence both individual destiny and collective history. Astrology was not mystical nonsense, but a natural science of correlations, a way to understand divine order in the cosmos. His precise astronomical data was essential to making accurate astrological predictions. Tycho Brahe stood at a unique moment in history. He believed in astrology deeply, but revolutionized astronomy in a way that would ultimately separate the two. His horoscopes and interpretations of celestial events reflect a time when science and spirituality were still one language, not two. It is necessary to understand that the understanding of the heavens must be founded on observations, not speculations. We're going to change it up a little bit again and talk about Tycho's love life and his marriage. Tycho entered into a morganatic marriage with Kirsten Jorgensdatter, a woman of common birth around 1572. This type of marriage, prevalent among European nobility during this period, allowed a person of high social rank to marry someone of a lower status without extending noble titles, privileges, or full inheritance rights to the spouse or their offspring. What is a morganatic marriage? A morganatic marriage is a legal arrangement where a noble marries a commoner, but the lower-ranking spouse and any children born from the union do not inherit the noble titles, estates, or privileges of the higher-ranking partner. This practice was designed to preserve the purity of noble lineage and prevent the dilution of aristocratic status. Tycho, born into a prominent noble family, was expected to marry within his social class. However, he chose to form a lifelong partnership with Kirsten Jorgensdatter, a woman of peasant origins. Their relationship began around 1572, and under Danish law, after 3 years of cohabitation, by approximately 1575, their union was legally recognized as a marriage. Despite the recognition, it remained morganatic due to the disparity in their social standings. Kirsten did not acquire noble status, and their children, while legitimate, were excluded from inheriting Tycho's noble titles or privileges. The couple had 8 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. Tycho and Kirsten lived together as a family for nearly 3 decades, demonstrating a deep commitment that defied the societal norms of the time. They resided primarily on the island of Hven, where Tycho constructed his famous observatory Uraniborg, and later moved to Prague when Tycho accepted a position under Emperor Rudolf II in 1599. The morganatic nature of their marriage had significant consequences. As a commoner, Kirsten did not gain noble rank or privileges through her marriage to Tycho. She remained outside the aristocratic sphere despite being his wife. Their 8 children were legally legitimate a status secured by Danish legal provision recognizing the marriage after 3 years of cohabitation. However, they could not inherit Tycho's noble titles or the associated privileges, such as certain land rights reserved for nobility. Tycho's decision to marry a commoner likely raised eyebrows among his noble peers, as it deviated from the expectation that he would marry within his class to strengthen familial alliances or enhance his status. Nevertheless, Tycho appeared to prioritize his personal bond with Kirsten over societal approval. Tycho Brahe died in 1601, and his passing triggered legal disputes over his estate. His noble relatives contested the inheritance rights of his children, arguing that their morganatic status disqualified them from claiming Tycho's wealth. However, King Christian IV of Denmark intervened, ensuring that Tycho's children could inherit his property, though not his noble titles or privileges. This royal intervention underscored the legitimacy of Tycho's offspring and highlighted the king's authority to override familial objections in such matters. Tycho's morganatic marriage to Kirsten reflects his willingness to challenge the rigid social conventions of the 16th century Denmark. Despite his stature as a nobleman and a leading scientific figure known for his precise astronomical observation and contributions to the Copernican revolution, Tycho chose a path that prioritized personal devotion over aristocratic tradition. His enduring partnership with Kirsten, spanning nearly 30 years, and his recognition of their children as his heirs, albeit without noble status, demonstrate a commitment that transcended legal and social barriers. Now, we are going to talk about some of Tycho's inventions. Some of them may have been brought up earlier, but we're going to talk about them again in a little bit more detail. Let me not seem to have lived in vain. Inscription on Tycho's mural quadrant, often cited as his personal motto. First, we have the mural quadrant. The mural quadrant was a large, wall-mounted instrument with a radius of approximately 6 feet, 1.8 meters. It was fixed in position and aligned to measure the altitude of celestial bodies as they crossed the meridian, the imaginary line where stars reach their highest point in the sky. This quadrant enabled Brahe to determine the precise positions of stars and planets by measuring their angular height during meridian transits, focusing on declination, celestial latitude. Known for its size and precision, the mural quadrant allowed measurements accurate to within 0.01 degrees, far surpassing earlier instruments. It was a cornerstone of Brahe's efforts to challenge existing astronomical models. Then we have the revolving wooden quadrant. The revolving wooden quadrant was a portable instrument made of wood, designed to rotate and track celestial bodies as they moved across the sky. It featured a sighting mechanism for continuous observation. Unlike the fixed mural quadrant, this instrument allowed Brahe to measure both altitude and azimuth, horizontal angle, of celestial objects at any time, making it ideal for tracking their motion over extended periods. Its mobility and flexibility complemented Brahe's fixed instruments, enhancing his ability to gather dynamic observational data. And then we have the Great Steel Quadrant. The Great Steel Quadrant was a durable version of the quadrant constructed from steel to reduce warping and flexing compared to wooden models. It provided stable, high-precision measurements of celestial altitudes, improving the reliability of long-term observations. The use of steel reflected Brahe's dedication to refining his tools, minimizing errors caused by material instability and ensuring greater accuracy. And then there is the sextant. Brahe's sextant was a large, precision instrument designed to measure the angular distance between two visible objects, such as stars or planets. Spanning 60 degrees, it included sights for accurate alignment. By measuring angles between celestial bodies, Brahe could determine their relative positions and monitor changes over time, essential for studying planetary motion. The sextant was vital for Brahe's attempts to measure stellar parallax, though unsuccessful due to technological limits, and contributed to his detailed records of planetary orbits. And then we have the armillary sphere. The armillary sphere was a complex model of the celestial sphere, featuring interlocking rings that represented key astronomical circles such as the equator, ecliptic, tropics, and meridians. It allowed Brahe to visualize and measure the coordinates of celestial objects relative to their reference circles, aiding in the study of the sun, moon, and planets' apparent motion. Brahe's version was larger and more accurate than its predecessors, reflecting his focus on precision and supporting his development of a new cosmological model. We also have the equatorial armillary, a specialized variant of the armillary sphere. The equatorial armillary was aligned with the Earth's equator, featuring rings for the celestial equator and equatorial coordinates. It facilitated measurements in the equatorial coordinate system, right ascension and declination, aligning with the Earth's rotation for easier tracking of celestial objects. By adopting this system, still used in modern astronomy, Brahe improved the efficiency and accuracy of his observations, making his data more accessible and consistent. And then next is the Great Celestial Globe. The Great Celestial Globe was a large, meticulously crafted sphere where Brahe recorded the positions of stars and planets, serving as a three-dimensional star map. It enabled him to visualize and track celestial movements over time, plotting over 1,000 stars as a physical catalog of his observations. One of the most accurate star maps of its era, the globe was a testament to Brahe's comprehensive approach and a valuable reference for his research. Brahe's instruments were distinguished by their large-scale, meticulous calibration and innovative designs, all aimed at achieving unprecedented precision. He often employed multiple observers and cross-verification techniques to minimize errors. His observatories, Uraniborg and Stjerneborg, were as much inventions as his instruments, reflecting his holistic approach to advancing astronomy. The data he gathered, accurate to within minutes of arc, challenged the geocentric model and provided the empirical foundation for Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Now, while much of his astrological output was not formally published, since astrology was more practical than theoretical, several records and horoscopes survive. Letters and manuscripts show his astrological calculations and predictions. His diary contains astrological notes, observations, and planetary conjunctions tied to political events. One of his published writings I wanted to touch on is translated as Introductory Exercises to the Restorations of Astronomy. It is one of the most impactful works, though it remained incomplete at his death in 1601. His assistant, Johannes Kepler, finalized and published it in 1602, preserving its legacy. The Introductory Exercises to the Restoration of Astronomy was envisioned as the first volume of a trilogy on recent astronomical phenomena. A key source notes the first volume of a projected work on recent astronomical phenomena. The second volume had been printed and privately distributed at Uraniborg in 1588 under title Die Munde Aethery. While the third volume was never completed, this initial work remains a monumental contribution. This writing focuses on three primary areas, each reflecting Brahe's innovative approach. One, the supernova of 1572. Brahe documented the sudden appearance of a new star in Cassiopeia, now recognized as a supernova. His detailed records of its brightness and position were groundbreaking, offering early evidence of dynamic stellar phenomena. Then we have restoration of celestial motions. Brahe aimed to refine astronomical models by correcting the motions of the sun, moon, and fixed stars. He compiled a catalog of 777 fixed stars, significantly improving upon earlier charts. And then we have astronomical instruments and methods. Brahe's precision stems from his innovative instruments like quadrants and sextants. The Introductory Exercises to the Restoration of Astronomy alludes to these methods, underscoring his unprecedented accuracy for the pre-telescopic era. Brahe's death left the restoration of astronomy unfinished, but Kepler stepped in to complete it. As one reference states, prepared for publication after the author's death by Johannes Kepler, who also wrote the appendix. Kepler's appendix and editorial efforts ensured the work's dissemination, while Brahe's data fueled Kepler's later discoveries, notably the laws of planetary motion. The restoration of astronomy transcends mere observation, making a shift in astronomical thought. Brahe's supernova findings challenged long-held doctrines, and his precise measurements enabled Kepler's breakthroughs. One source highlights this impact. Thanks to the precision of Tycho's measurements, Kepler discovered the first two laws of planetary motion and that the Martian orbit was elliptical, not circular as previously believed. Tycho's book is a seminal text that captures his revolutionary observations of the 15 supernova, refined celestial mechanics, and meticulous star catalog. Published by Kepler, it bridged Renaissance astronomy to the scientific revolution, providing the empirical foundation for Kepler's laws and reshaping our understanding of the universe. Its legacy endures as a testament to Brahe's genius and the collaborative triumph of early modern science. There is one more publication I would like to cover before we move on. Epistolarum Astronomicarum Libri. Tycho Brahe projected a series of printed volumes of selected scientific correspondence, but only the first book, Liber Primus, actually appeared. It was printed on his own private press at Uraniborg in 1596, with imperial and royal privileges. This physical volume contains correspondence between Tycho and Landgrave Wilhelm IV of Hesse, who we have mentioned before. Together with the Landgrave's court astronomer, Christopher Rothman, letters in German are followed by Latin translations, a bilingual presentation to maximize scholarly reach. Original plans for further volumes were never realized. Contemporary and later notices emphasize that only the first installment saw print, despite Tycho's broader publishing scheme. The volume includes engraved illustrations, initials, tailpieces, and crucially for historians of instrumentation, plates and descriptive sections of Uraniborg and Stjerneborg, plus a map of the island of Hven, integrating architectural and instrumental context with the epistolary material. Publishing selected correspondence served several strategic aims: securing priority for observational results and instrumental innovations, advertising methodological rigor, and fostering elite patronage networks. Wilhelm IV was himself an accomplished astronomical patron. Tycho's curation of letters with a princely collaborator positioned his reform program with a courtly scientific culture in which rulers participated intellectually, reinforcing a legitimacy for large-scale observational enterprises. Epistolarum Astronomicarium Libri, Libra 1, is organized as a chronological set of letters incorporating technical discussions on constructing and calibrating large quadrants, sextants, and globes, positional or observational data exchanges intended to refine star and planetary positions, cosmological argumentation related to comet trajectories and the rejection of solid celestial spheres, continuous of themes Tycho published separately in 1588. They talked on administrative or logistic matters, typical for collaborative large projects. It was bilingual presentation, German originals plus Latin translations, to bridge vernacular court usage and the pan-European scholarly republic. Also within these letters is discussion on precision instruments. Letters detail design principles of large fixed and mobile instruments to achieve sub-arc minute accuracy. The inclusion of plans visually corroborates these discussions, serving both technical dissemination and reputational display. There is also methodical standardization amidst these letters. Exchange of construction instructions and calibration approaches with Wilhelm Kessel's observatory illustrates a push towards standardized observational protocols, a precursor to later trans-European data networks. Tycho writes about the cosmological system as well. While the volume does not present a full systematic exposition, the correspondence undergirds Tycho's geo-heliocentric compromise later outlined formally in other works, showing him negotiating theoretical space between Ptolemaic and Copernican frameworks. The inclusion of Rothman's letters, a working astronomer under Wilhelm, showcases an intra-professional dialogue that could preempt rival narratives about who advanced specific observational or computational improvements. By fixing comet and nova discussions in a prestige printed form, Tycho reinforced his critique of traditional celestial ontology against residual Aristotelian defenders. Although only Book 1 appeared, it influenced the perception of observatory-based, instrument-centered astronomy as a collaborative enterprise, feeding into the early 17th century shift toward organized data collection, later exemplified in Kepler's and afterwards National Observatory programs. Now, as we begin to come to the end, I would like to leave us with a story about Tycho's twin and a poem he wrote. As we mentioned earlier, Tycho Brahe was born a twin, but his twin brother died at birth. The loss of his stillborn twin brother remained a part of Tycho's family story and personal identity. In 1572, at about the age of 25, Tycho composed a Latin poem titled "To My Twin Brother Having Died in the Womb," as a memorial to his lost twin. This short poem was Tycho's first published work, printed in Copenhagen in 1572. It takes the form of an epitaph, written from the perspective of the deceased twin. Tycho's classical education had trained him in Latin language and poetry, a prized skill for a Renaissance scholar, and he drew on that training to craft this poignant elegy. The piece was published as a standalone leaflet, and essentially marks Tycho's debut as a writer, demonstrating his humanist literary abilities alongside his emerging scientific interests. In the Brahe family, the surviving twin, Tycho, was given the name of his paternal grandfather, Thege, Latinized as Tycho. By contrast, this stillborn brother was not Christianed and remained unnamed, an issue Tycho addresses in the poem. The elegy thus not only commemorates the lost brother, but also reflects on Tycho's own existence as the twin who lived. It was composed at a formative time in Tycho's life. He had recently returned to Denmark from his studies abroad and decided to pursue astronomy full-time, and 1572 would also be the year of his famous observation of a new star, the nova. This context adds depth to the poem's meditations on life, death, and the heavens. Tycho's poem is written as if spoken by the dead twin to his surviving brother. The tone is consoling and philosophical. The opening lines present a haunting paradox of a life that ended before it began. I who died before I lived, and lived again, and buried in this earth, imagine what I was like. In these lines, the stillborn twin proclaims that he had died before living, but now revived in a new life beyond death. He invites the reader, or perhaps Tycho himself, to guess what I was like, emphasizing the unrealized potential of a life cut short. The poem continues to recount the circumstance of his death. Not yet born, I was enclosed in my mother's womb, when death became for me the gate of life. Here, Tycho uses the image death as the doorway to life, reflecting the Christian notion that an early death ushers the soul directly into the afterlife. The elegy then explicitly identifies the presence of the twin brother who survived the birth. The speaker notes that at the time another was joined in the same confinement, a brother still alive, for I was a twin. God, he says, granted the surviving twin Tycho the chance to enjoy life longer, so that he might witness the wonders of heaven and earth. In other words, Providence allowed Tycho to live in the world and behold its marvels, whereas the deceased twin's experience of life on earth was cut off. Yet, the crux of the poem is that the dead twin does not consider his own fate inferior to Tycho's. In fact, he suggests the opposite. Yet I have not obtained a worse lot than him. He inhabits the earth, but Olympus holds me. By Olympus, the poem refers to the realm of the gods, effectively heaven. The stillborn brother resides in eternal divine realms while Tycho remains on Earth. The next line elaborates that Tycho dwells on Earth, exposed to 1,000 perils, which the sea, the land, and even the stars inflict. Whereas Olympus holds me, and I enjoy peace and joy forever, united with the gods. This vivid contrast uses classical imagery, Olympus and gods, to convey a spiritual idea. The dead twin is in a state of eternal peace, spared from the dangers and sufferings of mortal life, while the living twin must face the trials of the earthly world. The inclusion of Quae simul astra ferunt, even the stars bring the perils, is particularly striking. It hints at the belief in astrological celestial influences on human fate, a topic Tycho was familiar with as an astrologer. One central theme of the poem is the contrast between the eternal and the temporal, a classical Renaissance and late medieval worldview. Tycho's verses echo the idea that above the sphere of the moon, all is eternal and unchanging, while below, on earth, is all change, risk, and decay. The stillborn child ascends immediately to the eternal Olympian realm of the gods, a metaphor for heaven, enjoying eternal peace and joy, whereas Tycho remains in the sublunary world of flux and danger. This reflects the influence of Aristotelian cosmology and Christian theology. Heaven is perfect and everlasting, earthly life is frail and impermanent. The poem is full of longing for the unchanging, eternal heavens, revealing Tycho's own yearning for cosmic permanence and divine truth. In giving his lost brother a voice from beyond, Tycho essentially expresses his spiritual imagination. He finds comfort in envisioning his twin in a palace of perfection and perhaps envies that state even as he toils in the imperfect world. Scholars have noted that this poem is revealing of Tycho Brahe's intellectual mindset and the themes that would pervade his life's work. As a historian of astronomy, Grahe observes Tycho's twin brother died before being baptized, and Tycho's Latin ode to him, published in 1572, stands as Tycho's first foray into publication, preceding even his scientific works. This indicates that Tycho, a nobleman astronomer, saw himself equally at home in the literary and philosophical culture of his era. Writing poetry in Latin was a hallmark of a well-rounded Renaissance scholar, and Tycho's ability to compose elegant elegy shows his grounding in the classics. The poem's classical reference, Mount Olympus and pantheons of gods, combined with Christian ideology, exemplify the Renaissance synthesis of pagan and Christian imagery. In Tycho's case, it underscores how he viewed astronomy and religion through a unified lens. The heavens were not just his scientific object of study, but also a source of spiritual meaning. The poem offers comfort that the separation between the twins is only temporary. The deceased sibling assures Tycho that when the surviving brother's mortal life at last ends, they will be reunited. When he too finally leaves behind his mortal limbs and lays his weary body down in the cold earth, then both of us will be joined again as one in the heavens, and he will also attain eternal good. This promise of reunion in heaven underscores the Christian hope of an afterlife where family bonds are restored. It also reflects a deep emotional longing on Tycho's part. The poem imagines a joyous reconciliation that transcends death. In the meantime, the unborn twin issues gentle advice to his living counterpart. He implores Tycho to patiently bear the weight of his body, the burdens of the earthly life, and let him not envy my fortune. This line is especially poignant. The dead child tells his brother not to envy the fact that he's bypassed the sufferings of life and went straight to a heavenly place. It's a subtle reversal of perspective. Usually one might pity the dead infant, but here the infant suggests the living might be the less fortunate one in some ways. This reflects a philosophical and perhaps somewhat stoic or Christian comfort. Dying innocent and early guarantees entry into paradise, whereas living longer means enduring life's dangers and sins. Tycho, through the voice of his twin, is reassuring himself that his lost brother is safe and happy, and that Tycho should accept his own earthly destiny without bitterness. So the closing lines of the elegy turn to the subject of the twins' name and identity. So swift a fate denied me a name among the living. The twin laments since an infant who died unbaptized would receive no given name. The poem then notes that the surviving twin carries the name of their grandfather in their stead. In fact, Tycho Brahe's own name, Tyge or Tycho, was given in honor of his paternal grandfather, Thij Brahe. By writing, he bears our grandfather's name, Tycho Brahe. The deceased brother essentially says that Tycho carries the family legacy for both of them. Finally, the dead twin narrator reveals the author's hand. He, Tycho, is the one who adorned our departed spirit with this poem, having lived through 5 lustra of his life. 5 lustra is 25 years, which was Tycho's age in 1572, confirming the autobiographical context. Thus, the poem ends by noting that Tycho, at age 25, has composed these verses to honor his twin's memory. The formal epigraph at the very end reads, "For his twin brother, dead in the womb, Tycho Brahe's Otto's son made this," followed by the publication line and date. This poem is a rich piece of blending personal grief, spiritual comfort, and cosmological thought. It provides valuable insight into Tycho Brahe's early intellectual development and emotional life. Through Latin verses, we witness Tycho's heartfelt homage to his lost twin and his contemplation of fate and eternity. The poem's themes, the hardship of life on earth, the perfection of the heavens, the hope of reunion after death, and the importance of carrying on a legacy resonate with Tycho's own journey as a scientist in a changing world. Modern scholars and writers continue to comment on this little elegy's importance, seeing it as the young astronomer's poetic meditation on mortality and the stars, one that eerily foreshadows the transformative discoveries he would soon make. Tycho's twin brother, though gone before birth, lives on in these Latin lines, and through them we gain a deeper understanding of Tycho Brahe's humanity behind his scientific genius. As we close the curtain on the life and legend of Tycho Brahe, it's hard not to feel the pulse of a man who lived with one eye fixed on the heavens and the other on the mysteries of fate. Born a Danish noble, yet destined for the stars, Tycho's curiosity flared the night he saw the heavens shift during the 1560 solar eclipse. Years of humanist schooling in Copenhagen, Leipzig, and Wittenberg refined his Latin, his mathematics, and his appetite for forbidden questions. A student duel cost him his nose, but that silver and gold prosthetic became a badge of stubborn originality, a visible reminder that discovery often exacts a price. On the tiny island observatory of Hven, Tycho forged instruments of unprecedented size and precision. The Great Mural Quadrant, the armillary spheres, the global celestial globe, turning naked eye astronomy into an exact science. His meticulous star catalog and nightly records of planetary motion would later furnish Johannes Kepler's with the raw data to carve the laws of planetary orbits. And then when the new star of 1572 blossomed in Cassiopeia, Tycho's measurements shattered the old Aristotelian dogma of an unchanging heaven, opening the vault of the fixed stars to change and to hope. Yet for all his steel-rimmed instruments and royal favors, Tycho's story is threaded with tenderness. He married Kirsten against noble convention and raised 8 children amid the brass sextants on Hven. He wrote a Latin elegy addressed to his twin brother who died before birth, confessing in verse a yearning for reunion where Olympus holds me. Even in court intrigues or exile to Prague, Tycho carried that poem like a quiet heartbeat beneath the clamor of courts and commons. So as we leave Tycho at his Prague desk, his lunar nose gleaming under candlelight, figures etched in iron gold ink, remember the 2 lenses through which he saw the universe. One, polished brass and calibrated to the arc minute. mapped the geometry of the cosmos. The other, the inward eye, measured loss, love, and the invisible threads tying a living brother to a brother unborn. Between those lenses lie Tycho's enduring gift, the proof that precision and wonder, reason and reverence can share the same sky. May we, like him, keep both eyes open. Okay, hold up. Did you really think I was going to mention a drunken elk before and not bring that back up again? Well, if you did, you're wrong. Imagine, if you will, Uraniborg at dusk. The courtyards on the island of Hven glow with furnace light from the alchemical cellars. Assistants hurry past herb gardens laid out with mathematical precision. The great armillary spheres and sextants flash brass in the last of the sun. This was Tycho Brahe's purpose-built research palace, residence, observatory, laboratory, paper mill, and printing press in one. Astronomers and visiting scholars stream through its doors to see the latest instruments and hear the latest arguments about the stars. And according to one of the strangest and most endearing episodes in the history of early modern science, they sometimes met another resident, a tame elk that trailed its master like an enormous antlered hound and had a fondness for beer. No, this story does not come to us as a tavern yarn polished by retellings, but through Tycho's own circle and scholarly apparatus that clustered around him. He published Epistolarum Astronomicarum Liber Primus, the first volume of his edited correspondence with Landgrave Wilhelm IV of Hesse-Kassel, the powerful German patron whose observatory at Kassel rivaled Uraniborg. Those letters have been mined over since by historians and biographers as a kind of documentary backbone to Tycho's life and work. The most influential retelling is J.L.E. Dreyer's classic 1890 study, which draws on the correspondence and on court records to give a sobering account of a deadly tipsy incident. In early 1591, the Landgrave wrote from Kassel asking about unusual cervids reported in Denmark and Norway, beasts taller than a stag. He wanted drawings, specimens, even tame animals for his park. Tycho replied that reindeer suffered in the summer heat. The Landgrave pressed on, noting that he already had an elk that trotted beside his carriage like a dog, and if Tycho could obtain 1 or 2 tame elks, he would be delighted. Tycho answered that he had indeed kept an elk at his estate in Scania and had planned to bring it across to Hven. What happened next reads like the punchline to a dark, courtly comedy. For a few days, the animal was lodged at Laskrona Castle, Laskrone in all the spellings, where, like any honored guest, it was led up a staircase to the dining rooms and treated to liberal quantities of strong beer. On its way down the stairs, the elk lost its footing, fell, broke its leg, and died. But the elk episode did not end Tycho's fascination with the species, though nor did it close the castle channel for curiosities. After Wilhelm's death in 1592, Tycho wrote in December of 1596 to Landgrave's son Maurice that he had finally sent the 2 elks the elder patron had so long desired. The letter places the animals not as a one-off pet, but as a part of a wider economy of exchange that bound princely courts and learned households together. Books and instruments traveled along these routes, but so did clockmakers, papermakers, and living emblems, creatures that stood for status, wonder, and the reach of a ruler's influence. If Tycho could promise 2 more elks, he must have had reliable channels to acquire and tame them. And a small terminological knot deserves untangling for some of us. In Europe, the word elk refers to Alces alces, or ALCES, what animal North Americans call a moose, long-legged, heavy-shouldered, with broad, palmate antlers. In the United States, elk usually means an altogether different deer. Tycho's elk is the European moose. It could climb stairs if it had to, but maybe it should not have been invited to do so after dinner. The elk's presence at Lascrona tells us that the boundaries of a research enterprise in the 1590s were broad. Laboratories opened into kitchens, instruments lived alongside animals, learning was entangled with logistics, hospitality, and showmanship. The same infrastructure that moved books and lenses could move creatures. The same house that fixed the positions of the planets could stage an evening that ended in a royal animal's misstep. Tycho's Uraniborg was not an ivory tower. It was a lived-in complex whose rhythm, meals, experiments, visits, performances could, on one unlucky night, converge into a single unforgettable clatter of hooves falling downstairs. In closing, let this picture resolve where it began. Uraniborg at dusk, instruments at rest, the household settling after a day of measuring the heavens. A giant shadow lingers at the top of a stair. Part curiosity, part emblem, part beloved pet, an animal whose presence in a palace of precision reminds us that the making of modern science was never bloodless. It happened in places where people ate and drank, printed and argued, bargained and displayed. The tame elk that loved beer and met its end on a castle staircase is more than a quirky footnote. It is a parable of Tycho's world, knowledge and spectacle bound together, letters and living wonders passing between patrons, a universe measured to fractions of a degree, and yet, now and then, ruled by the stubborn physics of hooves on stone. Until the next one.